Good morning and welcome to History of Interiors. Today we will be discussing ancient Rome. Rome began as a powerful city but would eventually grow into an expansive empire. While Rome had many similarities to other ancient cultures, their design innovations would be unprecedented. In this lecture, you will learn about the cultural and aesthetic impacts of the Roman Republic and Empire. On this slide, you can see a map of Italy, which is where the Roman Empire had the most impact. As a city, Rome was located centrally on the peninsula and had easy trade access to other societies that lined the Mediterranean. Still, the Roman Empire would eventually be far more expansive than this map can convey, extending all the way to the present-day United Kingdom and Arabian Desert. As we saw on the last slide, the capital city of Rome is very centrally located within the Italian peninsula, which is located in the Mediterranean Sea. It sits to the west of Greece, though there was still several trade routes between the two, which allowed Greece to have a heavy influence on Roman culture. Additionally, their location meant they experienced a very moderate climate and had access to a broad variety of natural resources, most notably marble and volcanic sand, which would become important to their construction projects later on. Due to the location of Rome, there was lots of contact with the Greeks. This exchange of culture had a great impact on the Roman religion, which was modeled after the Greek pantheon of gods. Overall, Romans did not have the same respect for philosophical thought that was present in the Greek culture. However, externally, their religions look very similar. Each of the gods in the Roman religion has a Greek counterpart, with the most important god Jupiter serving in the same role as Zeus. Jupiter was a sky god who the Romans believed oversaw all aspects of life. Jupiter also concentrated on protecting the Roman state, so military commanders would pay homage to Jupiter at his temple after winning in battle. Juno was Jupiter's wife and played a very similar role to Zeus's wife Hera. Juno kept a particularly watchful eye over women and all aspects of their life. And then we have Minerva, who embodied the same attributes as the Greek goddess Athena. She was the goddess of wisdom and craft, and she watched over schoolchildren and craftspeople such as carpenters and stonemasons. Despite the similar makeup of their religions, the Greek and Roman religions actually differed quite a bit. For as modest as the Greek religion was, the Romans lived in excess. The religion and culture of the Romans were complex and pompous, with the Romans trading in the Greek idealism for the idea of Roman realism. If you recall, the Greek religion did not allow for extremes of wealth and poverty, but the Roman religion thrived on such extremes. Additionally, where the Greeks were focused on the personal responsibility of each individual, the Romans largely ignored the principle of individuality. The religion was used to unite and inspire the people as a whole, but there was a very small focus on how the religion impacted the lives of each individual citizen. In addition to their own religion, Rome also allowed for several other religions to grow within their borders. After expanding their empire, there was large populations of people who followed monotheistic religions, unlike the polytheistic Roman religion. So these included Judaism and Christianity. However, these citizens were not often afforded the same rights as the Romans who followed the Roman religion. But as these continued to grow, they eventually would contribute to the downfall of Rome. So while Rome technically allowed for more than one religion to occupy their empire, they definitely showed favor towards those who followed the Roman religion directly. In general, we divide the timeline of Rome into three main sections: Early Rome, the Roman Republic and Early Empire, and the High Empire. On this slide, we will discuss the first two time periods, and we'll discuss the High Empire on the next slide. Prior to Rome, the Italian peninsula was inhabited by a group of people known as the Etruscans, who were centrally located north of the city of Rome, so closer to the Tuscany area near modern-day Florence and Milan. Um, the Romans eventually overthrew the Etruscans, beginning the Roman Republic. This is still in early Rome, though. Um, and as an important note, while this was known as a republic, it was in no way a democracy. The upper class had a great deal more power than anyone else, and there was a lot of inequality. Um, in the 4th century BCE, the Romans were able to expand their influence as they met with Greek culture. And then towards the end of the early Roman period, the Romans established the center of their empire at the Capitoline Hill in Rome, and this would be where they would build 3 great temples for Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva. The Republic and early empire mark a great shift for the Romans. In this period, cities began growing, and they actually had a great deal of city planning. So the cities were actually very well planned and often featured a grid system, which we still use in cities today. So think of New York City, where one can easily tell where they are as the grid is understandable and well numbered. Additionally, this time period saw the initiation of some of the great and ambitious building programs, such as the Forum, under the rule of Julius Caesar. So Caesar's career is a real turning point for Rome, as the Republic ended after his assassination. So as soon as he's gone, we immediately fall into that high empire, which we'll discuss a little bit later. But after the Republic, a period of anarchy arose until Julius Caesar's nephew, Octavian, who's also known as Augustus, was able to unite Rome under a more harsh and empirical rule. The last time period we will discuss is the High Empire. Under the High Empire, Rome would expand its influence the furthest it had been, with its rule extending from England to Turkey and down towards Egypt. Eventually, the Romans would conquer the Greeks, solidifying their role as a major world power of the day. After a short period of disarray and anarchy, Octavian, also known as Augustus, would unite the empire under a single ruler. He is largely considered to be the first emperor of Rome. His rule marked the beginning of a 200-year stretch of peace known as the Pax Romana. Augustus would remark that he found Rome a city of bricks and left it a city of marble. In large part, this was due to the expansive construction projects that Rome would take on during the days of the Roman Empire, including several that you will probably recognize, such as the Colosseum and the Pantheon. The Romans also built several public amenities such as baths, sports arenas, stadiums, bridges, and aqueducts. Unlike the Greeks, the Romans did not value the ideals of democracy. Augustus established an autocratic form of government where he was the sole ruler and made all of the important decisions. Although we refer to him as Rome's first emperor, Augustus never took the title of king or emperor, nor did his successors. They all preferred to call themselves princeps, or first citizens, or primus inter pares, first among peers. This choice of title maintained the appearance of limited power that had been so important under the Republic. However, we know that the power was not limited, and Rome was actually functioning as a dictatorship. Due in large part to the strict rule of the emperor, Rome was an incredibly brutal and inhumane place to live. Although it may have seemed civilized to certain people at certain times, the Roman Empire was built on brute force and military strength. Local inhabitants obeyed Roman rule because the alternative was often too horrible to consider. Probably the most famous aspect of Rome's gruesome history are the events that took place in the Circus Maximus and later in the Colosseum. Emperors built these grand stadiums to entertain the masses and keep them happy, and the most popular forms of entertainment were undeniably gory. This type of entertainment often relied on the exploitation of lower classes, while the wealthy watched them get horribly maimed or killed. As we discussed on the last slide, Rome had a very expansive reach. This image shows a map of the Roman Empire at its height. As you can see, it includes much of Europe and goes down into Africa and the Middle East. While the government of Rome varied dramatically from the government of Greece, their architectural styles were actually quite similar. Many of their orders were refined versions of the Greek orders. However, the Romans added their own twist. Additionally, they introduced two more architectural orders, the Tuscan order and the Composite order. We will discuss these more in a moment, but the general idea is that the Tuscan order was very similar to the Doric order, and the Composite order combines the Ionic and Corinthian orders. Just like in Greece, all of these orders were standardized, meaning that there was a specific way they were to be used and built. An important figure from this time that you should know is Vitruvius. Vitruvius was a Roman military engineer and architect who wrote De Architectura on architecture, a treatise which combines the history of ancient architecture and engineering with the author's personal experience and advice on the subject. This is the only surviving document of the sort that we have, which is why it is so critical to our understanding of ancient architecture. Much more than a book on buildings and machines, the contents of On Architecture reveal the ancients' much wider concept of what exactly architecture is, and it describes such topics as science, mathematics, geometry, astronomy, astrology, medicine, meteorology, philosophy, and the important effects of architecture, both aesthetic and practical, on the everyday life of citizens. In short, according to Vitruvius, the successful architect and engineer should have both theoretical and practical knowledge based on a broad and deep understanding of all of the sciences, arts, and even nature. Even more importantly, for Vitruvius, buildings should always be three things: beautiful, stable, and useful. There are some important omissions from the book on architecture, notably amphitheaters, aqueducts, arcades, and some of what we today might consider to be the greatest Roman buildings, such as the Roman baths, are dealt with only briefly. Nevertheless, the work is a fascinating insight into the field of ancient architecture and was hugely influential from the Renaissance period onward. This image compares a Greek and Roman column. You can see the Greek column on the left and the Roman column on the right. Both of these are Ionic columns, but there are some key differences between the two. Most notably, the Greek column is a little less rigid and features softer, more curvilinear lines, whereas the Roman capital is a bit more harsh. You still see the scrolls, but they are connected through strict, straight lines. Still, these orders were standardized, so they would have looked exactly the same on every Roman building wherever they were used. Once again, while there are some differences, these styles are quite similar, and you can see a clear influence of Greek architecture on Roman architecture. On this slide, we will go into more detail on the parts of the column, mostly just the major details. This should be similar to what we learned in the Greek lecture. This is going over the Greek column one more time. So if you can see number 1 on the left side, that shows the entablature, which has many other parts and components within it. Still, the entirety of what is sitting on top of the column is the entablature. So if you look over at number 2, which features all of that stuff towards the top of the entablature, you see the cornice. Below that, at number 3, you have the frieze. This is the area that would have been highly carved and decorated. And below that, at number 4, you have the architrave, which is just that part that sits right above the capital of the column. This is a close-up of the Roman column, and once again, you can see we have another entablature. And on here you can see a couple of new moldings that we have only seen briefly before. So if you look at number 15, you can see that egg and dart pattern, which features an oval with some darts in between. And then below that at number 16, you see some dentils, which are those teeth-like rectangles, which we discussed a little bit in the Greek lecture. Number 13 is just another example of an architrave, which sits below the frieze and above the capital. And then at the top, up at number 12, you see the fascia board. This is still part of the overall cornice, but it is a little bit different than any of your other moldings, which is why it's important to understand that that fascia board is just that flat piece that comes at the very bottom of a cornice. So we've seen this before, but this image offers a great example of this feature. To continue our discussion of Roman architecture, we're going to look at some of the main features and materials used. First, the Romans had one great advantage when it came to construction. They developed a formula for concrete using an incredibly strong form of cement. As you may know from a construction course, cement is a binding element used in concrete, and it's incredibly important to the overall stability of the structure. The Romans were able to use lime and volcanic sand and rock to form a cement, which in combination with other materials created an incredibly durable form of concrete. For the Romans, this meant that rather than building structures entirely out of marble, which, while durable, would have had a somewhat hard time to work with and would have worn away faster, they could construct buildings out of concrete and simply plaster a veneer of marble over the top. This gave the same grand illusion of Greek architecture while being much simpler to construct and far more sturdy. Additionally, Romans developed a unique arch system that can be seen in several of their architectural features. The Roman arch is a full half circle, sometimes referred to as a full arch, so it had a uniform radius for the 180-degree semicircle. This was often used for arcades, barrel vaults, and as the base for domed-style structures, such as the Pantheon. As we have discussed before, Rome had many architectural achievements under its belt, all of which we will touch on later in this lecture. These include the Colosseum, the Forum, the Pantheon, and the public baths. The first architectural feature that we will study is the colonnade. This is basically exactly what it sounds like it would be. It's just a series of columns. Simply put, a colonnade is a series of columns supporting an entablature. These were really popular in Rome, and they were also used for centuries after the fall of Rome. Many buildings actually still utilize this today. In this image on the right, you can see an arch with a voussoir and a keystone. As you can see, the arch is a full arch with a uniform radius in a full semicircle. The voussoirs are the little stones that line the main part of the arch, and the keystone is the centermost stone in the arch. This stone is incredibly important as it bears the weight of the arch and holds everything together. Once again, this was by far the most popular arch of the time and one that would continue to be used throughout the following centuries. This image here shows an arcade. An arcade is a succession of contiguous arches, with each arch supported by a colonnade of columns or piers. An arcade is very similar to a colonnade and actually utilizes a colonnade, but it includes the added elements of the arches in its construction. This is an Arch of Triumph, and it is the first major piece of architecture that we will discuss. As you can see, it is a freestanding structure of two pillars connected by an arch. In general, these arches were used to signify a victory in war. Triumph over enemies was incredibly celebrated among the Romans. The Roman triumph was an ancient martial tradition, a parade so riotous that its symbolic culmination involved catapulting the victorious general to quasi-divine status for a single day. Essentially, the leader would be considered a god for a moment as the Romans celebrated their victory. On many of these arches, which would cross over the path of the victory parade, one would see the story of the victory and the likeness of the leader depicted. This specific image shows the Arch of Titus. The Arch of Titus is located in Summa Sacra Via, the highest point of the Sacra Via, Rome's sacred way, that served as the main processional street. Furthermore, the Arch of Titus commands a key point along the triumphal route, one that visually links the valley of the Colosseum to the valley of the Forum and the Capitoline Hill beyond. Many triumphal parades had passed along this route for many centuries. Thus, the choice to place a permanent triumphal monument astride this route was not accidental, but rather deliberately evocative of the fact that the triumph as a ritual both created and reinforced collective memory for the Romans. This arch, built as an honorific monument, honored Titus posthumously and was a project executed by his younger brother and imperial successor Domitian. The most important thing to note about these triumphal structures is the longevity of their influence. To this day, we know what these arches signify, and they have often been repeated well into the relatively modern era. For example, one of the most infamous arches of triumph was actually constructed in the 1800s, millennia after the fall of Rome. In this arch, the Arc de Triomphe, that is located in Paris, honors those who fought in the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. To this day, this arch is a symbol of inspiration for the French military. This image here is of the Arch of Constantine, which is another example of a triumphal arch. The Arch of Constantine is located along the Via Triumphalis in Rome and is situated between the Colosseum and the Temple of Venus at Roma. This location was significant, as the arch was a highly visible example of connective architecture that linked the area of the Forum to the major entertainment and public bathing complexes of central Rome. Constantine was an incredibly important figure in Roman history. The Emperor Constantine, called Constantine the Great, was significant for many reasons. These include his political transformation of the Roman Empire, his support for Christianity, and his founding of Constantinople. Constantine's status as an agent of change also extended into the realms of art and architecture. The Triumphal Arch of Constantine in Rome is not only a superb example of the ideological and stylistic changes Constantine's reign brought to art, but also demonstrates the emperor's careful adherence to traditional forms of Roman imperial art and architecture. The monumental arch stands approximately 20 meters high and 25 meters wide and 7 meters deep. 3 portals punctuate the exceptional width of the arch, each flanked by partially engaged Corinthian columns. The central opening is approximately 12 meters high, above which are identical inscribed marble panels, one on each side, that read, "To the Emperor Caesar Flavius Constantinus, the greatest, pious, fortunate, the Senate and the people of Rome, by inspiration of divinity and his own great mind, with righteous arms, on both the tyrant and his faction, in one instant, in rightful battle, he avenged the public, dedicated this arch as a memorial to his military victory." While we currently consider this to be a great piece of art, added onto over the centuries, this was not always the case. According to an article by Dr. Andrew Findley, until relatively recently, art historians viewed the blocky sculptures and the use of the spolia in the arch as signs of poor craftsmanship, deficient artistry, and economic decline in the late Roman Empire. Even one of the most prolific and influential art historians of the modern age, Bernard Brenson, titled his short book on the arch, The Arch of Constantine, The Decline of Form. More recently, however, analysis of the arch has focused on the political and ideological goals of Constantine and the objectives of the artist, which has highlighted new possibilities for the interpretation of the art. If indeed the spoliated older material from the arch can be traced to the reigns of Trajan, Hadrian, and Marcus Aurelius, then it situates Constantine as one worthy of the same level of reverence as those emperors, all of whom earned deserved levels of acclaim. This was vitally important to Constantine, who had himself essentially bypassed lawful succession and usurped power from others. Moreover, Constantine encouraged major social change in Rome, such as decriminalizing Christianity. Any religious change was a threat to the ruling and political classes of Rome. By aligning himself with well-regarded emperors of Rome's 2nd century CE Golden Age, Constantine was signaling that he intended to model his rule after earlier successful leaders. This image shows what remains of the Roman Forum, and you can see where the Arch of Constantine sits within this space. According to an article detailing the history of the Roman Forum, The Roman Forum was a site located at the center of the ancient city of Rome and was the location for important religious, political, and social activities. Historians believe people first began publicly meeting in the open-air forum around 500 BCE, when the Roman Republic was founded. The rectangular-shaped area, sited on a low-lying land between the Palatine Hill and the Capitoline Hill, was home to many of the ancient city's most impressive temples and monuments. According to a widely accepted legend, ancient Rome was founded by brothers Romulus and Remus in 753 BCE. After a rising conflict, Romulus killed Remus and became the king and named Rome after himself. The traditional story also credits Romulus with starting an alliance with his rival Titus and making the site of the Roman Forum a neutral meeting zone. At first, the Forum essentially served as a marketplace for day-to-day shopping. Over time, it became much more versatile and functional as public affairs were held in the area. The Forum gradually developed, progressed, and expanded over many centuries. Statues, arches, basilicas, and other buildings were constructed to accommodate the gatherings. Around the reign of Julius Caesar, the Forum became overcrowded. Caesar is credited with building a new Forum off to the side of the original to offer more space. Later, the Emperor Augustus also added on to the area. The Forum was considered the heart of Rome. While there were many other forums in Rome, the Roman Forum was the most significant. It was a multi-purpose site that accommodated various functions. Events taking place in the Forum included elections, public speeches, criminal trials, gladiator matches, social gatherings, business dealings, public meetings, religious ceremonies, educational events, and the buying, selling, and trading of items. The Roman Forum was reconstructed many times during its existence. This allowed for various forms of architecture from different eras to merge together. Influence from each period can be seen in the design and construction of the buildings. Roman architects were greatly influenced by classical Greek designs, but the Romans also created their own signature structures, such as basilicas, triumphal arches, domes, Roman baths, and amphitheaters. Materials ranged from concrete to marble. Over time, many economic and political events began to take place in more elaborate structures to the north of the Forum. The last major expansion of the Roman Forum took place during the reign of Constantine in 312 CE, but most of the ancient buildings and sites in the Roman Forum were destroyed in 410 CE, around the time that the Roman Empire began to fall. During the Middle Ages, the land that was once the Great Roman Forum was reduced to a pasture for grazing animals. The area became known as the cattle field and was essentially an overgrown and neglected field. The Roman Forum was rediscovered by archaeologist Carlo Fea in 1803. Excavations to clear the area took over 100 years. In fact, it wasn't fully excavated until the early 20th century. Because the Romans built over earlier ruins, the remains from several centuries can be found in the Forum. On this slide, you see several images of the Colosseum, which served as a space for brutal entertainment. The lower images show what the building looks like today, thousands of years after it was built, and the upper image shows a reconstruction of what the Colosseum would have looked like. In each of these images, you can see the arcade, which is that series of arches supported by columns. As you can probably tell, this style of arena is the predecessor for many sports arenas that we see today. According to a National Geographic article, the Colosseum, also named the Flavian Amphitheater, is a large amphitheater in Rome. It was built during the reign of the Flavian emperors as a gift to the Roman people. Construction of the Colosseum began sometime between 70 and 72 CE under the Emperor Vespasian. It opened nearly a decade later and was modified several times in the following years. The massive structure measured approximately 189 by 156 meters, or 620 by 513 feet, towered 4 stories high, and included 80 entrances to the amphitheater, 76 for the patrons, 2 for the participants of the events, and 2 exclusively for the emperor to use. The sheer number of entrances proved to be necessary. The Colosseum could hold more than 50,000 spectators at its maximum capacity. The Colosseum saw some 4 centuries of active use until the struggles of the Western Roman Empire and the gradual change in public taste put an end to gladiatorial combats and other large public entertainments by the 6th century CE. Even by that time, the arena had suffered damages due to natural phenomena such as lightning and earthquakes. In the centuries to come, the Colosseum was abandoned completely and used as a quarry for numerous building projects, including the cathedrals of St. Peter and St. John, the Palazzo Vienza, and defense fortifications along the Tiber River. Beginning in the 18th century, however, various popes sought to conserve the arena as a sacred Christian site, though it is still a fact uncertain whether early Christian martyrs met their fate in the Colosseum, as had been speculated. Thousands of people perished in the Colosseum over the years, and some of them were undoubtedly Christian. However, there is no conclusive historical evidence to support the connection between the stories of Christian martyrs and the Colosseum. By the 20th century, a combination of weather, natural disasters, neglect, and vandalism had destroyed nearly 2/3 of the original Colosseum, including all of the arena's marble seats and its decorative elements. Restoration efforts began in the 1990s and have proceeded over the years as the Colosseum continues to be a leading attraction for tourists from all over the world. This image shows the interior of the Colosseum. You can see where the spectators would sit, as well as the intricate tunnels below the main stage where the animals and participants would have been kept. I would once again like to reiterate how brutal the games that took place in the Colosseum were. It was impossible to know with certainty, but it is believed that as many as 400,000 people perished there between gladiators, slaves, convicts, prisoners, and a myriad of other entertainers over the 350 or so years during which it was used for human blood sport and spectacles. The most common event and the most well-known were the gladiator battles, but the Colosseum also held hunts, executions, and right at the beginning, a few naumachia, which were staged naval battles for which the Colosseum was actually flooded. This image shows some construction drawings of the Colosseum. In the upper right-hand corner, you can see a floor plan which shows the ovular shape. And then in the upper right-hand corner, you can see 2 section cuts. These show the great depth of the building. So it was incredibly wide at the base in order to support all of the height that it would have for a freestanding structure. And then lastly, you can see the perspective image, which shows the massive volume of the Colosseum. Like I said, you had to have a lot of weight at the bottom to hold the weight at the top. And then you can also see which materials were used. So concrete was vital to holding up this structure and was used as the probably main source material for this, and then that would be covered up by that travertine, which is a type of marble. So on this slide, you see another image of a section cut of the Colosseum. Once again, just to point out that base had to be really wide to support the top. But then you also see an elevation of the Colosseum. And what's really particularly interesting about this elevation is the use of the different columns. So there were 4 stories to the Colosseum, and they included 4 different styles of columns. So the bottom row of columns, so on that first story, would have actually been a Tuscan column. The middle column, so the second to the bottom, is Ionic, and then the top 2 were a form of simplified Corinthian columns. This differed from Greek columns, despite the fact that they had a lot of the same influences. On a Greek building, you would rarely, if ever, see 2 different styles of columns used in conjunction with one another, but this clearly combines all 3 types of major columns. So that would have been a major difference between the 2. This image is another section cut of the Colosseum, but it shows the social order of it. So as you can tell, the senators, which would have been high society, had the lowest seats and were closest to the actions, followed by the knights, followed by the plebeians, and then poor women and slaves had to all be seated towards the top of the Colosseum. So there was a hierarchy in where you got to sit based on your status within society. This is an image of the Pantheon. The Pantheon is one of the best preserved monuments of ancient Rome. The structure, completed around 126 to 128 CE during the reign of the Emperor Hadrian, features a rotunda with a massive domed ceiling that was the largest of its kind when it was built. The Pantheon is situated on the site of an earlier structure of the same name, constructed around 25 BCE by statesman Marcus Agrippa, the son-in-law of the first Roman Emperor Augustus. Traditionally thought to have been a temple for the Roman gods, the structure's name was derived from the Greek words pan, meaning all, and theos, meaning gods. The original Pantheon was destroyed in a fire around 80 CE and was rebuilt by the Emperor Domitian, only to be burned down again in 110 CE. Hadrian became the emperor in 117 CE, a time when the Roman Empire included much of present-day Europe, as well as parts of the Middle East and northern Africa. Passionate about art and architecture, he embarked on a building campaign during his reign, which lasted until his death in 138 CE. It is unknown who the existing Pantheon's architect was or exactly what role Hadrian played in the project. Evidence suggests that the Pantheon was dedicated around 126 to 128 CE, although construction might have started under Hadrian's predecessor, Trajan, who served as emperor from 98 to 117. It's uncertain why, but Hadrian put Agrippa's original inscription on the new Pantheon. Marcus Agrippa, the son of Lucius, 3 times consul, made this, which led to centuries of confusion about its origins. No one knows the original purpose of the present-day Pantheon, but Hadrian sometimes held court there. In 330, the capital of the Roman Empire was transferred from Rome to Constantinople by the Emperor Constantine. Afterwards, the Pantheon fell into a long period of disrepair. In 476, the German warrior Odoacer conquered the western half of the Roman Empire, where Rome was situated. The Pantheon's long decline continued. Then, in 609, the Pope got permission from the Byzantine Empire to convert the Pantheon into a Christian church. It was the first Roman pagan temple to be consecrated as a Christian church. The conversion played a key role in the Pantheon's survival, as the papacy had the resources to repair and maintain it. Moving on to the interiors of Rome, they were incredibly similar to the Greek interiors. For example, both building types featured a centralized plan with a central atrium for light. Neither had exterior windows. Roman buildings often featured a cloister, which is basically a porch with one side lined by walls and the other lined by an arcade or a colonnade. As in Greek buildings, there were separate areas for men and women, which should come as no shock, as we know that the Romans did not consider women to be the equals of men. There were several forms of decoration that were popular during the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire. Often the buildings featured mosaic floors and frescoed walls. Much like in Greek buildings, the walls showcased a dado or a wainscot, as we would call it today. Additionally, the Romans often would use a pedestal, which would be inscribed to explain what was above that pedestal. The furniture of Rome was also similar to the furniture of Greece. Disc-turned legs and clines were still quite popular. The cline is actually known as the lectus during this time. However, rather than clines being common for bedding, these were often set up in a triclinium, which was a formal dining room. This allowed for people to lounge while they ate. Tripod tables would also become quite popular during this time period. These were exactly as they sound, a table that rests on 3 legs. These could be made out of various materials, whether wood, stone, or bronze. In this image, you can see the setup of a triclinium, which is a formal dining room. The triclinium was the Roman dining table of 4 sides, with 3 low couches placed around it so as to leave the 4th side free for the servants. There were strict rules of etiquette which dictated how these rooms should be used properly. Note the setup of the furniture and the way each person would have sat in exactly the same direction, despite that being inconvenient for conversation. However, as I mentioned earlier, there were set customs that dictated how these rooms should be set up and used within ancient Rome. This image here shows a tripod table, which is simply a table with 3 legs. As you can see, this one is highly decorated and features the statues of women holding up the main part of the table. While this would have been heavy, it was relatively portable. In general, tables in Greece were used for meals and then put away, rather than being on display at all times. However, the Romans took a different approach. As a people, Romans were much more materialistic than their Greek counterparts, which meant they often needed tables to serve as permanent platforms for the objects they wished to display. This also explains why the tables were so highly decorated and highly regarded within their culture. People would pay great amounts of money for tables made from various types of woods and metals. These pedestals showcase 2 of the main decorative elements that were popular during the Roman Empire. First, you can see the arabesque feature in the center of the top image. The vine-like imagery would have been seen on many decorative pieces throughout the empire, as it was a simple but beautiful pattern. The other decorative element that you can see here is known as a griffin, which is a composite creature with the head and wings of an eagle and the tail and hind legs of a lion. Both of these creatures were seen as majestic and powerful, which contributes to their popularity within Roman civilization. The griffin was considered to be the king of all creatures and was known for guarding treasures and priceless possessions. This image here shows a Klein with turned legs. As you can see, the legs are carved in the round, which would have been made on some mechanism that turns the wood as the craftsman carved. This piece would have been used as a bed, though it is very similar to the lecti we saw in the triclinium. Once again, this is a very similar piece to what we saw in Greece, which further shows the ties between the 2 cultures. Still, this Klein is more heavily decorated than the ones previously studied, as the Romans had a much higher regard for the value of personal possessions. As I have mentioned before, the Romans believed in the value of decoration. Their high regard for the decorative arts led to their development of several types of ornament. First, the Romans often used mosaic tiles. This technique allowed the artist to use small pieces of tile or stone and mortar to create an image or pattern. This is a pretty long-lasting art form, though it does require a skilled hand to install it properly. Mosaics are older than the Romans. The Greeks had made frequent use of them. In Rome, however, they became an important art form for the first time, and the mosaic technique spread across many parts of the empire, so all the way up to England and across to that Arabian desert. They also commonly used niches, which were decorative spaces that were recessed into a wall for the purpose of displaying a statue, a vase, or some type of other object. We still see these quite often today to display art. In terms of paintings, frescoes were quite popular, and this technique is known for being incredibly long-lasting, but it is a very tricky technique to learn. So frescoes require that the paint is applied to wet plaster, so you put the plaster on the wall, and then while that is still wet, you go ahead and paint on top of it, which means when the plaster dries, the paint actually dries all the way into it. So like I said, this makes it an incredibly long-lasting type of art, but you do often have to work in sections and hope that, your formulas for everything are staying the same and that you're drawing everything at the same scale. So it does take quite a while to learn how to do that properly and how to do that well. Sculpture was also pretty popular. Remember that the Romans had access to marble and bronze, which made sculpture a really popular medium for art because they had so many materials that made it simple to use. Remember how long that fresco process would have taken, how difficult that would have been. So, as difficult as carving or sculpting may seem, even their painting at the time wouldn't have been that much easier. Another thing that they had to use as decoration were the festoons and swags. So those are what you would see in draperies today. Sometimes those would be painted onto the walls. Remember, they did not have windows that went out into the street, so they would often paint on windows and give a trompe l'oeil or fool the eye to believe that you were looking out over some type of grand architecture or a field or something like that. So they were essentially painting windows and painting draperies in a way that would make it look like they were there, since they often didn't actually have those windows or walls to do that. Other forms of Greek ornament include the griffin and the honeysuckle and the egg and dart pattern that we've seen before. And then, similar to the Greeks, they also valued vases quite heavily. So there was lots of vases continued from those Greek traditions into the Roman traditions. The Portland vase is a Roman two-handled glass amphora dating to between the second half of the 1st century BCE and the early 1st century CE. The vase has a cameo-like effect decoration, which perhaps depicts the marriage of Peleus and Thetis from Greek mythology. After a long history of changes in ownership, disaster struck in 1845 CE when the vase was smashed to pieces in the British Museum. Fortunately, it has since been painstakingly restored so that it can once more take its rightful place amongst the finest masterpieces of Roman art. The vase is 24.5 centimeters in height and 17.7 centimeters in its maximum width. The vase was made by blowing the dark cobalt blue colored glass covered with a layer of opaque white cased glass. Large areas of the white glass were then removed to reveal the underlayer of blue. Areas of white were left and carved in relief to depict scenes. This style of decoration has led scholars to date this piece to the reign of Augustus. The fineness of the details of the decorative scenes is comparable to the highest quality of Roman cut gems, and so it must be the work of a superbly talented gem cutter. The two-handled amphora vase is incomplete because it has lost its pointed base and the mouth of the vessel is curiously uneven in cut. The base was repaired using a similar colored disc carved in the same style and depicting Paris. Although it is remarkable that such a delicate object has survived at all from antiquity, this vase is not unique, as a similar type vase has been found at Pompeii, which dates back to the mid-1st century CE and depicts scenes from a grape harvest. However, these cameo-cut vessels are regarded as something of an experiment in Roman glassware carried out in a limited period spanning just 2 generations, so they were almost certainly not commonly produced. So as you can see here, all of that technique that we were just talking about, I know it looks black, but that's actually a very dark cobalt blue, and it is a type of glass layered with white glass over the top. And this is known as a dip overlay, and we really didn't know about this until recently. And then this specific one, the Portland vase, is from the collection of the Duels of Portland. In terms of patterning, most all of these you will have seen before. So the guilloche, the rinceau, the moldings, the flutings, the egg and dart, as well as the enthymeme and the palmette. We've seen all of that before in Greece, so just go back through all of that. So remember that guilloche is the braid-like pattern, a rinceau is a little bit more wave-like. All of those moldings that we saw on the entablatures before are on the entablatures once again. And then we have fluting, which is those little channels that go into the columns. One thing that the Romans added was that golden mean, which just means that there's a specific proportion that they believed everything should be built to, which is known as the golden mean. And then we've seen the egg and dart. Down here on the second row from the bottom on the right-hand side, you can see that enthymeme and swag. So the swag is, like I said, just what you would see at the top of draperies quite often, and the enthymeme is once again that honeysuckle motif. The palmette is very similar to the enthymeme, once again a motif, except this time it's in a circle. This is often seen nowadays around chandeliers in big fancy buildings and such like that. Much of what we know about Rome we learned from the city of Pompeii. We will have another mini lecture on Pompeii, but I want to give you a brief overview for now. Greek settlers made the town part of the Hellenistic sphere in the 8th century BC. An independently minded town, Pompeii fell under the influence of Rome in the 2nd century BC, and eventually the Bay of Naples became an attraction for the wealthy vacationers from Rome who relished in the Campania coastline. By the turn of the 1st century CE, the town of Pompeii, located about 5 miles from the mountain, was a flourishing resort for Rome's most distinguished citizens. Elegant houses and elaborate villas lined the paved streets, which included stepping stones so that one could walk above the rainwater and the dirt. Tourist townspeople and slaves bustled in and out of the small factories and artisan shops, taverns and cafes, and brothels and bathhouses. People gathered in the 20,000-seat arena and lounged in the open-air squares and marketplaces. On the eve of the fatal eruption that happened in 79 CE, scholars estimate that there were about 12,000 people living in Pompeii and almost as many in the surrounding regions. The Vesuvius volcano did not form overnight, of course. The Vesuvius volcano is part of the Campanian volcanic arc that stretches along the convergence of the African and Eurasian tectonic plates on the Italian peninsula and had been erupting for thousands of years. In about 1780 BC, an unusually violent eruption shot millions of tons of superheated lava, ash, and rock about 22 miles into the sky. That prehistoric catastrophe destroyed almost every village, house, and farm within a 15-mile radius of the mountain. Villagers around the volcano had long learned to live with their volatile environment. Even after a massive earthquake struck the Campania region in 63 CE, a quake that scientists have now come to understand offered a warning rumble of the disaster to come, people still flocked to the shores of the Bay of Naples. Pompeii grew more crowded every year. 16 years after that telltale earthquake, in either August or October of 79 CE, and most of the recent evidence puts this in October, not in August, Mount Vesuvius erupted again. The blast sent a plume of ashes, pumice and other rocks, and scorching hot volcanic gases so high into the sky that people could see it for hundreds of miles around. As it cooled, this tower of debris drifted to earth. First the fine-grained ash, then the lightweight chunks of pumice and other rocks. It was terrifying but not yet lethal. Most Pompeians had plenty of time to flee. For those who stayed behind, however, conditions soon grew worse. As more of the ash fell, it clogged the air, making it difficult to breathe. Buildings collapsed, and then a surge, a 100 miles per hour surge of superheated poison gas and pulverized rock poured down the side of the mountain, swallowing everything and everyone in its path. By the time the Vesuvius eruption sputtered to an end the next day, Pompeii was buried under millions of tons of volcanic ash. About 2,000 Pompeians were dead, but the eruption killed as many as 16,000 people overall. Some people drifted back to town in search of lost relatives or belongings, but there was not much left to find. Pompeii, along with the neighboring towns of Herculaneum and a number of villas in the area, was abandoned for centuries. Pompeii remained mostly untouched until 1748, when a group of explorers looking for ancient artifacts arrived in Campania and began to dig. They found that the ashes that had acted as a marvelous preservative. Underneath all that dust, Pompeii was almost exactly as it had been 2,000 years before. Its buildings were intact. Skeletons were frozen right where they had fallen. Everyday objects and household goods were littered in the streets. Later archaeologists even uncovered jars of preserved fruit and loaves of bread. Many scholars say that the excavation of Pompeii played a major role in the neoclassical revival of the 18th century. Europe's wealthiest and most fashionable families displayed art and reproductions of objects from the ruins, and drawings of Pompeii's buildings helped shape the architectural trends of the era. For example, wealthy British families often built Etruscan rooms that mimicked those in Pompeian villas. Today, the excavation of Pompeii has been going on for almost 3 centuries, and scholars and tourists remain as fascinated by the city's eerie ruins as they were in the 18th century. So, as I mentioned on the previous slide, people in Pompeii, when the final aspect of the volcanic explosion happened, died immediately where they were, and much of their body was incinerated, but it left these hollow holes essentially as the lava cooled. So on this slide, you're seeing an image of a plaster cast, which was made by pouring the plaster down into one of those holes. And it gives us the shape, and from that we know a lot about human evolution as well. So we can see, back when this event occurred, about what the average height was of people. We know a lot about how they dressed and how they lived their daily lives from moments like this. On this slide, you see an image of a Pompeian street. So this shows you kind of what the buildings would have been like in relation to the roads. So you can see some of those larger stones, which would have been the stepping stones that we had previously discussed, as well as one of those arcades. So remember, that's got a colonnade on one side and wall on the other, very similar to what we would consider to be a porch today. This image shows those stepping stones in a little bit more detail. So once again, these were almost elevated surfaces so that you wouldn't get caught up in the rain. But they still would have been plenty low that carts could have gone over them. It wouldn't have really inhibited everyday life, but it would have made it easier when there were events like rain. On this slide, you can see a floor plan of a Roman house. So as you can tell, it does still have that atrium in the middle with no windows along the exterior. But unlike the Greeks, whose domestic architecture did not match their public architecture, the Romans' living quarters were as highly developed as personal finances would allow. Roman citizens lived in townhouses, apartments, and country villas, and Roman emperors lived in incredibly elaborate versions of the Roman home or villa. So as you can see here, there are several separate rooms and hallways. It would have been quite a maze to walk through. In this specific one, you don't see that separation between quarters for men and quarters for women, which was incredibly clear if you compare it to the Greek floor plan. But several of the tenants are the same, despite the fact that they were ultimately quite different. On this slide, you can see an image of that atrium. So this is taken as though you were standing in one of those interior rooms, and all of the light that you see is coming in from that atrium. So those atriums would have been quite large to make sure that you're getting the proper amount of lighting for whatever daily task you were completing in the room. But you also needed a rather large atrium, not only to illuminate the surrounding interior rooms, but also because that was the only means of allowing fresh air into the space. So remember, they didn't have any windows facing out towards the street, which would have been great as far as safety was concerned, but ultimately pretty poor in regards to ventilation. So they actually needed these large spaces to make sure that they were getting the proper amount of clean air. This image shows the remains of an atrium. So as you can see, there was a little water feature here in the middle. We obviously can't tell exactly where rooms were placed around this one, but we can see how much light is reflecting into it. So there still would have been a lot of light getting in through this atrium when it was originally built. And then, as I mentioned a couple of slides ago about the Roman housing being far more excessive than the Greek housing, you can see the detail of the mosaic work in the floor of that water feature, as well as the decorative statue. So like I said, they would have definitely had a high regard for the decoration of the space. They wanted to show off how much wealth they had, because remember, in the Roman society, extremes of wealth and extremes of poverty were actually quite common. If you'll remember earlier, we did have a decent conversation about the furniture that would have been popular in Rome, but here you can see it in context. So you have that tripod table, which sits in the foreground, so that just means that it has 3 legs, and you can see here it has what look to be horses or seahorses, so those animal type legs. And then this would have been the view through the cloister into an interior atrium. So that's what's going to be happening in the background of this image. So this table would have sat kind of in the center of the room, looking out over that atrium. In terms of the ornament used on the Roman houses, we don't actually have the same evidence towards polychroming that we do in the Greek society, but we do know that they would have veneered their columns with different types of marble and stone as a means of providing color. So remember, they have that terracotta, as well as access to just some different types of marble that the Greeks did not have access to. So where the Greeks used paint, the Romans would often use different types of stone to provide that color. And they also would have had several different Roman motifs. So going back to that griffin, that Endymion, all of which we discussed earlier on in this lecture, would have made their way onto the exterior of buildings. The last thing we're going to talk about today is the Roman influence on the rest of the world. So, as we mentioned before, during the time that they existed, the Roman Empire was the largest Western empire, and it had so much influence over that section of the world. But as things were rediscovered and we learned more about Roman culture, which kind of got lost in those Middle Ages, it began to gain popularity all over again. So the French neoclassic and French Empire, as well as the late Georgian and Regency styles in England, leading into the American Empire style, all of those are going to be revivals of Roman architecture and Roman design. So while this is the first time that we've seen a lot of these different techniques being used and different building designs being used, it is certainly not the last time that we will see that. And then just in our modern life, we still definitely have relics of the Roman influence living on. So think back to any sports arena that you've ever been in. They would have had very similar building techniques to the Colosseum. Definitely a similar design. Most of them are probably oval. And then the shopping mall design also goes around their shopping centers, and the way that we know they had individual rooms set up for individual shops, but kind of serving as a collective of different artisans there to sell their pieces. Their building material, that discovery of concrete, would become incredibly influential. As we've seen, we definitely still use it today. But that recipe was lost for a while. So there's actually a time period after the fall of the Roman Empire where we don't have access to concrete for building. But now that we do, it's become a staple in securing foundations and making sure that everything stays together. And then additionally, some architectural elements that we have Romans to thank for are that full arch. as well as the dome, the barrel vault, and the arcade, each of which are pretty popular still today. So, the main thing that you should review in this lecture is going to be those different column designs, specifically how they relate to the Greek columns that came before that. The architecture of Rome, once again, is incredibly influential, so it's critical that you understand it before moving on. So, here you can see a little worksheet, which feel free to print that and go over it. And then you will also find in your module some helpful study materials as well. So good luck with the rest of your module and have a great rest of your day.